Paul Jones had always been a simple man, leading a calm and predictable life, dedicated to his wife, Claire Jones. They lived in a modest house, surrounded by plants that Claire lovingly cared for, reflecting the harmony of a marriage that lasted over 50 years. Claire was his balance, his constant companion. Together, they raised Grace Kelly and Evan Baxter, their 2 children who, despite taking different paths in life, always knew that their parents were the center of the family. Paul had a sacred routine: breakfast with Claire, evening conversations, and slow walks around the neighborhood. Life seemed peaceful until one day, without any warning, Claire suffered a sudden heart attack. In mere seconds, she was gone. Claire's absence fell on Paul like an unforeseen storm, sweeping away everything he knew. His home, once a sanctuary of comfort, now felt empty and lifeless. In the weeks following Claire's death, Paul began to change, as if his soul was slowly fading along with his memories. He got lost in small details. He forgot where he placed his keys, repeated questions, and looked at old photos without immediately recognizing them. ALZHEIME'S began to creep in silently, like an inevitable shadow. His children, busy with their own lives, had yet to grasp the gravity of the situation. Grace, the eldest daughter, had always been closer to her mother. Sensitive and thoughtful, she tried to fill the void Claire's death had left, visiting her father frequently. She noticed Paul's slight memory lapses, but believed they were just part of grieving, something temporary. Evan, on the other hand, lived a busy life in another city. A successful lawyer, he was more practical and emotionally distant. For him, life went on, and grief was something to be faced with firmness and objectivity. He seldom visited his father, and when he did, their conversations were brief and superficial, avoiding what he considered emotional weakness. But Claire's death was the trigger for something deeper within Paul, something he couldn't even articulate. The pain of loss turned into forgetfulness, and ALZHEIME'S progressed faster than anyone could have predicted. With each passing day, Paul sank further into his confused memories, while the present became a blur. The story begins here, with Paul sitting in his armchair, where Claire used to read, gazing at an old wedding photo. He holds the frame with trembling hands, but his once clear eyes now seem lost. The pain of grief and the fog of ALZHEIME'S are beginning to take over. He whispers Claire's name, unsure if she's in another room or truly gone. The silence of the house echoes this doubt, as Paul unknowingly embarks on his journey away from reality. Paul sits in Claire's armchair, his eyes drifting somewhere in time, while Grace watches him from the kitchen. She notices how he spends more time in silence lately, clutching that wedding photo like a talisman. Grace, trying to sound cheerful, "Dad, would you like some tea? It's cold today." Paul looks at her, but it seems to take a moment for him to understand. He tilts his head, and for a brief instant, his expression lights up. Paul, with a faint smile, "Claire always loved tea. Where is she?" Grace pauses, her heart aching. It had been weeks since he began confusing Claire's absence, as if his mind was playing with time. Grace, gently, "Dad. Mom, she's not here anymore, remember?" He frowns, looking again at the photo. His hand begins to tremble, and he murmurs, almost as if speaking to himself. Paul, unsettled, "Oh, yes, of course. But she must be on her way. She always comes back right after her walk." Grace looks away to hold back tears. She takes a deep breath and continues making tea, aware that ALZHEIME'S is advancing faster than she's willing to admit. But what can she do? She believes taking care of him at home is still possible. Grace, trying to keep her composure, "Why don't you rest a bit, Dad? Tomorrow we can go for a walk in the park. You love those trees." Paul, looking at the floor, Claire loved the park. At that moment, Evan enters the door, his presence immediate and slightly tense. He carries an air of someone always in a rush, even when standing still. His well-tailored suit and serious expression contrast with the serenity Paul used to cultivate. Evan, rigid, without warm greetings. "Grace, can we talk?" "Now." Grace looks at her brother, already anticipating what's coming. She finishes serving tea to her father and leaves him on the couch, heading to the kitchen with Evan. There, Evan immediately starts speaking in a low but urgent voice. Evan, straightforward, this can't go on, Grace. Dad needs professional care. You're not trained to handle Alzheimer's. Grace crosses her arms, clearly exhausted but determined. Grace, frustrated, Evan, he's our father. He needs us, not to be locked up in a facility. You barely come here, you don't know how he really is. Evan sighs, running a hand through his hair as if trying to control his frustration. Evan, rational. I understand that you want to care for him, but this isn't about you, Grace. Look at him. He doesn't even know Mom died. He gets lost. What if he leaves the house again in the middle of the night? What will you do? Grace looks away, the memory of that recent night still vivid in her mind, when Paul disappeared for hours, trying to find Claire. She knows Evan is partially right but doesn't want to admit it. Grace, defensive, I know he needs help, but, Evan, he's at home. It's where he feels safe. I can't leave him alone now. He still has moments of clarity, you've seen that. Evan shakes his head, exasperated. Evan, calm but firm, Grace, this disease will only get worse. We need to be practical. What will happen when he remembers nothing? When he doesn't even know who you are? The silence between them is heavy. Both are trapped in their own pain and beliefs. Grace still believes she can keep the family together, caring for their father as a way of honoring Claire's memory. Evan, however, sees the responsibility as a burden that needs medical intervention. Grace, frustrated but gentle, I'm not asking you to understand, but please, just spend more time with him. He needs both of us. Evan looks at her, his eyes tired. For a moment, he seems to hesitate but soon returns to his practical stance. Evan, sighing, I'll think about it. But something has to change. Paul, sitting on the living room couch, looks out the window, lost in memories of Claire. He whispers to himself, Paul, she must be around. Claire always comes back. The following weeks are marked by a significant decline in Paul's condition. His forgetfulness, once subtle, begins to take on more alarming proportions. Not only does he confuse dates and faces, but he also fails to recognize Grace at times, calling her Claire. The memories that once connected him to reality now sink him into a confused and painful fog. Paul wakes up in the middle of the night looking for Claire, wandering around the house as if he were lost in a place that once was his safe haven. Grace, increasingly exhausted, tries to keep the situation under control. But after an incident where Paul attempts to leave the house again, believing Claire is outside waiting for him, she finally admits she needs help. Evan insists on admitting him to a facility, but Grace, determined to find an alternative, remembers a friend's suggestion about German new medicine. Though skeptical, she decides to give it a try. She schedules an appointment with Dr. Eduard Lopez, a renowned therapist in alternative therapies specializing in German new medicine. On the day of the appointment, Grace takes her father to the clinic. Paul, with a distant look, holds one of Claire's old hats, stroking it with his fingers as if it could bring her back. Dr. Eduard Lopez welcomes them into a quiet room, decorated with soft tones and natural light. He observes Paul attentively, but also notices the exhaustion on Grace's face. With a warm smile, he begins to speak. Dr. Eduard Lopez, Grace, I understand how difficult it is to see your father in this state. Alzheimer's, from the perspective of German new medicine, is not merely a physical breakdown. There's a deep emotional component tied to what he's experiencing. Grace, who had only heard vaguely about this approach, frowns in confusion. Grace, what do you mean by that? He's forgetting everything. This isn't just about emotions, it's a disease. Dr. Eduard Lopez nods, maintaining a calm, explanatory tone. Dr. Eduard Lopez, yes, of course, it's a physical condition. But in German new medicine, we believe many diseases originate from unresolved emotional shocks. Alzheimer's, for example, may be directly related to a separation conflict. Your father lost the person who was his emotional anchor, and this may have triggered a biological process in the brain that results in symptoms of forgetfulness and confusion. Grace looks at her father, who remains oblivious to the conversation and takes a deep breath. Grace, so you think he's like this because he lost my mother? Dr. Eduard Lopez observes Paul for a moment before responding. Dr. Eduard Lopez, exactly. The loss of your mother was the trigger. When someone experiences such a traumatic event, like losing a life partner, the brain can enter a kind of survival mode. For him, this mode is attempting to protect him from the pain of separation, and unfortunately, this affects his ability to process memories. Paul, still stroking Claire's hat, looks at Dr. Eduard Lopez as if he only caught part of the conversation. Paul, Claire, she said she would come back. She always does. Grace holds her father's hand, feeling the overwhelming pain of seeing him trapped in a loop of confusion. Grace, but what does this mean? Can he get better? Dr. Eduard Lopez leans forward slightly, carefully choosing his words. Dr. Eduard Lopez, Alzheimer's, Grace, is a complex disease, and German new medicine doesn't promise a miraculous cure. What we can do is help your father work through the grief he hasn't fully processed. His mind is stuck in the shock, and over time, we can try to ease that emotional impact, which may bring some clarity in his moments of lucidity. Grace, torn between skepticism and hope, feels that this approach might offer something more humane than simply placing her father in a care facility. Grace, so he needs to somehow resolve this grief? Dr. Eduard Lopez, yes. We can try to do this through emotional reconnection therapies, which help a person integrate loss in a more conscious way. Alzheimer's is a way for the mind to cope with a trauma so profound it manifests in the body. We'll take small steps to try to reverse, or at least ease, this process. After the session, Grace and Paul return home. Grace isn't sure if the therapy will make an immediate difference, but for the first time in a long while, she feels there might be a possible path. A path that doesn't involve abandoning her father in a facility, but offers a chance for him to somehow reconnect with himself. And now, how do you think this story will end? Share your theories in the comments before the grand finale. The days after the session with Dr. Eduard Lopez brought a glimmer of hope for Grace. The therapist had suggested she talk about Claire with Paul, allowing him to express his repressed emotions. However, Paul's symptoms continued to worsen. He became increasingly confused, mixing up his children's names, forgetting if he had eaten, or even where he was. Grace tried to apply the techniques suggested, but her exhaustion was reaching its limit. One night, everything falls apart. Paul, in a moment of deep confusion, decides he needs to find Claire. He leaves the house without Grace noticing and begins walking through the dark streets of the neighborhood. When Grace finally notices his absence, panic takes over. She runs outside, shouting for her father, but he is already gone. Grace calls Evan, crying, desperate. Evan, Dad is missing. He left the house, and I don't know where he is. I don't know what to do. Please help me. Grace says, shouting into the phone, panicked. Calm down, Grace, I'm on my way. We'll find him, Evan responds, his voice tense but trying to stay calm. Evan arrives minutes later, and together, they begin to search the streets, calling for Paul. The cold night air is biting, and the silence makes Grace's heart beat even faster. She tries not to think of the worst, but the fear suffocates her. After nearly 2 hours of searching, they find Paul sitting on a bench in the park where he used to walk with Claire, gazing at the lake with the same lost look as always. She must be around here. She always comes back home, Paul murmurs to himself. Grace runs to her father, hugging him tightly, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. Evan, standing a few steps behind, watches the scene in silence, visibly shaken. Dad, please, don't do this again. You scared me so much, Grace says, crying. Paul looks at her, his eyes still confused, but for a brief moment, he recognizes her. Grace, you. I didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted to see your mother, Paul says in a low voice, as if awakening from a dream. Evan approaches slowly, and seeing the pain in his father's eyes, something inside him breaks. The emotional barrier he had built over all this time crumbles. He finally realizes that his father is not just a problem to be solved, but a man who is losing everything: his memory, his past, his wife, and that by trying to keep his distance, Evan was also losing. "Dad, I'm sorry for not being around more, for not understanding sooner," Evan says, his voice trembling. Paul looks at Evan, blinking a few times, as if struggling to remember. Then, in a rare moment of clarity, he says, "You're my son, Evan. Claire would be proud of you, of both of you." The simple, yet meaningful words hit Evan hard. He sits beside his father and, for the first time in a long while, places a hand on his shoulder, as if seeking to reconnect in some way. "Dad, we're here with you. Always," Evan says, emotionally. The emotional breakthrough happens at that moment. The weight of the distance Evan had imposed on himself out of fear of pain is lifted, and Grace, even amid the chaos, feels a small relief seeing her brother finally open up. Back at the house, while Paul sleeps, Grace and Evan sit together in the living room, where the silence finally feels lighter. For the first time, they speak honestly about their fears. "I was so scared of losing Dad, of losing you. I thought that if he were in a facility, it would be easier. I was wrong," Evan admits, opening up. "I understand, Evan. I'm scared too, every day. But he needs us now, more than ever," Grace replies softly. They make peace there, in the warmth of an honest conversation, accepting that despite all the challenges, what matters is that they are together to face whatever comes. The months that followed that night in the park were marked by ups and downs. Although Paul's Alzheimer's continued to progress, something profound had changed in the family dynamic. Grace and Evan were closer than ever, united by their love for their father and the memory of Claire, finding ways to share Paul's care without the old tension that had separated them. Despite the care, visits to Dr. Eduard Lopez, and occasional moments of clarity, the disease advanced relentlessly. Paul began having difficulty recognizing even the most familiar faces. Some days, he seemed present, but on many others, he was completely lost in the shadows of his mind, calling for Claire or murmuring incoherent phrases. One afternoon, Grace was sitting beside Paul on the porch, holding his hand while he looked at the garden without truly seeing the flowers Claire had loved so much. The silence between them was comfortable, but filled with unspoken emotions. "The flowers. Claire always said they bloomed more beautifully in the spring," Paul murmured, his voice distant. Grace squeezed his hand, feeling her heart tighten. She knew the end was near. With each passing day, Paul grew more fragile, and she was silently preparing for the inevitable. That same evening, Evan arrived at the house with a bouquet of yellow flowers, Claire's favorite. He entered the living room and placed them in a vase, saying nothing, simply offering the silent presence Grace so needed. The two sat beside Paul, who was lying on the sofa, his breathing soft but visibly weaker than before. "Remember when we used to go to the countryside in the summer? Dad loved to drive, even though Mom said he always got lost on the way," Evan said, breaking the silence and smiling slightly, trying to bring up a happy memory. Grace chuckled softly, recalling moments that seemed so distant yet still alive in her memories. "Yes, he never admitted he was lost. He'd just say he was exploring new paths," she replied. They laughed together, their voices low so as not to disturb Paul, who seemed immersed in a deep sleep. But suddenly, Paul opened his eyes. His gaze, though tired, was clearer than Grace and Evan had seen in weeks. "You too, so much like Claire, so strong," he said softly, his voice tender but with a clarity that took them by surprise. Grace and Evan froze, astonished at his clarity. Grace leaned closer, her eyes filling with tears. "Dad, we're here, with you," she said, moved. Paul looked at them, his eyes shining with a tenderness that Grace and Evan hadn't seen since Claire had passed. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, he seemed at peace. "Claire, she's calling me. I think it's time for me to go," he said with a faint smile. Grace couldn't hold back her tears. She had known this moment would come, but hearing her father's words was like a knife to her heart. Evan, on the other hand, took a deep breath, holding back tears, but his eyes showed the pain. "Dad, it's okay, we're okay. "We'll be all right," Evan said, his voice trembling. Paul closed his eyes again, a last peaceful smile on his lips. His breathing slowed down more and more until it finally stopped. The silence in the room was broken only by Grace's sobs as she embraced Evan, both feeling the weight of the moment. Paul's funeral was simple, just as he would have wanted. Family and friends gathered to pay their last respects. But what remained engraved in Grace and Evan wasn't the sadness of the loss, but the peace they felt from reconciling before the end. They knew Paul and Claire would be together again, and that brought an unexpected solace. That night, after the funeral, Grace and Evan returned to the family home. They sat on the porch, watching the stars shining in the clear sky. "He's with Mom now, Evan." "Together, as they always were," Grace said, smiling, her eyes glistening with tears but also relief. "Yes. And he left us something precious, each other," Evan replied, nodding with a soft smile. Grace hugged him. The reconciliation between them was the most important legacy Paul had left. Despite everything, the illness and the loss, the family was finally at peace.